More coffee. Morning. Okay. Today's going to be a fun one, I hope. It'll either go tragically wrong or it'll be incredible. So let's take a look at the homework. We'll start here. Objectives 1 through 4 you've been able to do for a while, so just a reminder, those we haven't even been talking about for the past several lectures that you have. I hit more buttons over here. Need an IT person here. Make this faster. So 1 through 4 you've been able to do for a while. We haven't even been talking about them for the past few lectures. So hopefully everybody's good, at least on the content of that. If you have questions, though, I'm always happy to take them. Today we want to talk about Objective 5. We've been talking about the background for this for a bit, getting HTTPS going with a self-signed certificate. We've been talking about the background. We talked about encryption, how it works, how HTTPS works with the TLS handshake and symmetric keys with RSA to sign the partial symmetric encryption key from the server. We talked about all that stuff. And we briefly mentioned Nginx last time. I started the demo at the end of last lecture. What I want to do today is start that demo over from the start, because we didn't really get that far and it didn't work anyway. And essentially just go through Objective 5. So if you ever have questions when you're doing Objective 5, when you're finally working on that assignment, this is your lecture. Watch this lecture. Hopefully it goes well and I have it working by the end. I'm confident. I think it will, but there are a few just one character typos that can destroy everything, so hopefully I don't make those typos. But this is what we want to do, set up HTTPS with a self-signed certificate. Let's do exactly that. I want to head over to PyCharm. And I have my backup here, just in case I get lost, I can refer to that, which I probably will have to. And I want to start over directly from scratch with from Nginx. Oh, I might as well type that too, just so we have officially a complete, fresh thing. So right now I have, is that running? Oops. So right now I have a server which is running using the setup that we've had before. So we have a Mongo database and our app running in 2 separate containers. And we have things set up the way that we would. And this ports, do we have comments in A? We do. These ports we'll actually get rid of along the way. So what we want to do is set up Nginx as a reverse proxy, which is going to listen on both ports 80 and 443. And if it gets a request on port 80, we're going to treat that as an HTTP request. And a request on port 443 is going to be a request for an HTTPS request, or HTTP over TLS. And this is the standard out there. If you just type in HTTP and then some domain name, it'll make a request on port 80, which will and it will not be encrypted. If you say HTTPS and then the domain name and whatever URL you're going to, it's going to make a request on port 443 and it will be encrypted. And it'll go through the TLS handshake first. For development purposes, we usually stick with these high port numbers for a variety of reasons. But when we go to deploy, we're going to want to use ports 80 and 443, and that's what we'll do with Nginx. When we add this, Nginx will be our communicator to the outside world. It will speak to the outside world for us, and then when it gets requests for us, it's going to send those to our server, and our server is going to handle them after that. So let's set that up. So I like to put, since Nginx is a completely different thing, I like to put it in a separate directory. So we're going to go in a separate directory just to keep Nginx separate from everything else. Nginx will need its own Docker file. And then in this Docker file, we're going to set up our Nginx, which luckily Docker has us covered here easy enough from Nginx. So that's going to download the Nginx container and install it on my machine, then we can run or download the Nginx image technically, and then we're going to create an image, a container using that image, and that will run Nginx. It already has Nginx inside of it. It's all configured and ready for us. what we want to do, I shouldn't say configured, but it's good to go out the box. And we're going to configure it further to be able to work as a reverse proxy for our specific app. So if I just do from Nginx, we're going to eventually want to expose ports 80, capital letters, expose 80, expose 443. Those are the two ports we're going to use. And then in my Docker Compose, I need to add Nginx here. I'm going to call it Nginx just because I called my Mongo image Mongo. I'm calling my Nginx image Nginx. Call my app image app. You don't have to get crazy with the naming. And then I want to specify the Docker file for this image. So for our app, we said build and then dot. That was just like when we built with the command line, we would have that trailing dot. That means look in this directory for a file named Docker file and use that file to build the thing. So we're in a different directory now for the Nginx app. So under that /Nginx to say, look in this directory. This is relative to the directory of the Docker Compose file. Look in this directory for a Docker file. It's going to find that Docker file that starts with from Nginx and then build the container off of that Docker file. And then I want to expose a few ports. So I'm going to map, just like we did down here, with an S. That's one character, at least that one my IDE catches for me. And I'm going to map local port 80 to port 80 inside the container. So I'm using 80 inside the container. I'm going to map that to 80 outside the container. You can use any mapping you want. You could have Nginx listed on port 8000 or 5000 or whatever you want. But eventually, you have to expose port 80 of the local machine. This is how we're going to communicate to the outside world, and this is what's required for the homework too. Port 80. We also want to expose port 443. So we're going to map port 443 localhost to port 443 inside this container. And these are the ports that we're going to use. If we compose this, if we run this, now Nginx isn't set up with my app at all. We have a lot more to do. But if we run this, we should see Nginx doing something. We should be able to be aware that it is running. So if I go to localhost, Nginx is running. It's mapping my local port 80. I didn't specify any port here. I just said localhost. I didn't specify any port, so it's going to be port 80, and Nginx is listening and saying, hey, this is Nginx, but you haven't set anything up yet, just raw Nginx, which is ready to host files. We could put our HTML or CSS or JavaScript, any static files, into that container and have Nginx host them, and it'll be really good at caching those and really fast, very efficient. But we don't want to do that. We're going to forward everything to our server. Just for our purposes. In practice, you probably want Nginx hosting all your static files, especially if you have a lot of traffic on your site. So we have our Docker Compose set up. We have a container that's being built and then exposing those two ports, which I'm pretty sure, actually, let's experiment a little bit. I'm pretty sure these exposes are optional. We'll find out together. So if I refresh before it's done building, it should be broken. And then once it's done building, once pip is done installing, I think we do still see the app. Yeah, those are optional. So the exposes are optional. Let's leave those out just because when you map ports in Docker Compose, it will expose the ports that you're mapping to. It's going to assume that you want to expose those ports. At least to Docker Compose. So we don't have to expose them in the Docker file. So we'll leave those off. but we need some configuration. So Nginx Configuration, it's a lot of, it's just a lot of syntax. I'm going to try to do this from memory. If not, I'm just going to use my backup and cheat. But I'll try to do this from memory. There's no need for you to memorize this. Look up the documentation, watch this lecture once we get to the end and have everything working. But I want to do this from memory and try to explain it as I go along. So you're going to create a server, which is going to say, here's a section. That's not the right terminology, but here's a thing that Nginx can do. The reason you specify a server is because you can specify multiple servers. So why even have that step? Of course, if you're going to run a server, if you're using Nginx, you're going to set it up as a server. But we specify it and block it out like this because you can have multiple servers on the same instance of Nginx. Just like we saw last time, I have multiple sites running on the same instance of Nginx. Each one of them has its own server block, which says if the request is for this domain name, map to this thing over here. And you can do you have all kinds of flexibility with this option. So you don't just have one server of Nginx. Nginx is going to get a request and effectively do some routing based on multiple servers. We're only going to use one for the homework, but that's the reason we have to specify the server block, is so we can specify multiple server blocks, which is a really nice feature. I'm going to specify the server name, which in our case is localhost. I'm going to specify that I want to listen on port 80. And I'm going to say route all traffic, everything that starts with a slash. Whenever you get a request that starts with a slash, which is everything, do this to it. So we can have multiple locations. If you want different paths being handled differently, then you can create multiple locations. We'll just create one and forward everything to our server. And I'm going to specify proxy pass, which is going to be the URL to forward traffic to when we get a request. So everything on port 80, every path on port 80, forward to this URL. My server only speaks HTTP, so I need to specify HTTP for this. The URL better be HTTP, because my server doesn't know what to do with HTTPS. Your server won't know what to do with HTTPS. We just don't know what to do with that. So HTTP, but this traffic is internal to our server, so we don't care about encryption. So HTTP, and then the server name specified in our Docker Compose. If I name this World's Coolest App, up here, I need to say World's Coolest App. Whatever I need to name that to route effectively using Docker Compose, just like when you connect to your database, you don't say localhost, whatever, like all the tutorials say. When you're inside Docker Compose communicating across containers, you specify whatever name you gave that service in Docker Compose. So if you didn't name yours app, you have to put something else there. You'll name it whatever you named it. You'll call it whatever you named it here. And then whatever port you specify inside your app. I foresee this as being a big office hours question. The port that your app listens on inside the app container. In my case, this is 8,000. And if I go to my server, I'm using port 8,000 inside the container, which might not be 8080. If you're using 8080, that's what we used to use outside the container. That's what we mapped from localhost. We mapped localhost 8080 to port 8,000 inside the container with this setup. You might have changed some ports. The internal port, you had to use 8080 for the homework, but you might have changed the internal one. Whatever your internal port is, that's the one you have to specify, because we're forwarding this to the container running your app. So this is being routed to your container, not to localhost outside of the container, which would be port 8080. In fact, I commented out the 8080. We're not even listening on 8080 right now. So inside the container, port 8080. and we need to specify the proxy HTTP version, which is 1.1 for our case. Yes?
Do you want live card to be location?
I do. Thank you. It was just muscle memory. Thank you. And the fact that you didn't call me out on proxy HTTP version must mean I got that one right?
Yeah.
Yes. I was a little hesitant on that one. I'm like, proxy HTTP, or is it proxy pass HTTP, proxy HTTP version? So now everything, we're going to listen on port 80 for any traffic requested for localhost. In localhost, when we go to deploy, this would change to our domain name, whatever domain name you purchase is, and then route all traffic to my app's port 8000. If I run this, it still won't do anything. It'll just still say, welcome to Nginx. There's a critical step that we have to make, is we need to get that configuration file inside of our container. So right now, that file only exists on my hard drive. It's not going to make it inside the Nginx container, which is where we really need that thing. So we're going to have a copy. So far, we've only seen copy ... which just copies all the files into the working directory inside the container. We have to do things a little bit differently now with Nginx, because Nginx is looking in a very specific place for this configuration file. So we need to get this file in a specific location with a specific name. And then when Nginx runs, it's going to read that configuration file and then use that file. So I want to get default conf. I'm going to copy my default configuration file. And conveniently, default conf is what Nginx is expecting it to be called, not coincidentally. And I want to copy that into the root directory of the container. So notice I'm not using a dot here. This is something, if you're new to file paths and Linux and things like that, this is one of the things that takes a while to be like, why is that dot so important? Dot means the current directory. So I want to copy from the current directory the file default conf. But when I'm inside the container, I want to start with a slash without a dot. A slash without a leading dot means go to the root directory of the machine, of the hard drive, or of the file system, rather. So go to the root directory of the file system, and then I'm going to put what's called an absolute path, which means the path, no matter what directory I'm running this from, I'm always going to get the same exact directory because I'm always starting at the root directory and then navigating the directory structure. If I start with a dot, that's what we call a relative path. It means relative to the current directory that I'm in, do whatever. So like in our Docker compose, we would say, build my app from whatever Docker file you find in this directory. That's a relative path. Go from this directory to the Nginx directory and look for a Docker file. Same thing over here. And we want a very specific path here, /etc/conf.d/default.conf. That's exactly where Nginx is looking for a configuration file. We can have multiple configuration files. I actually use sites enabled on mine, if you saw that, if you were extremely observant last time. But this is where, if we only have one configuration file, we can put it here, and that's the one configuration file that Nginx is going to use. So now, if I run Nginx, if I run this app, this 3-container app now, we should be able to see my app. This is where I'll hold my breath a little bit and hopefully, one typo here, which that looks right. I'm pretty sure I got that. But one typo anywhere can mess this whole thing up. But I should see an app that looks something like homework code. Give it to me. Damn it. Maybe it just wasn't running yet. There's a lot that can go wrong here, so it's not at all surprising. And it gets me to be able to do something that I want to show anyway. Let me do a quick scan. Semicolon, thank you. Let's see if that does it. Hopefully that's the only mistake. I can always copy my backup code, but I'd much rather not because it sends a bad message. Like, you can't even do it during lecture. You expect us to. I don't want to send that message. Hey, there we go. So we got our homework-looking code here. 1 semicolon. This is the back in my day. We actually had to do that. We had to manually scan for semicolons. It's a skill I've almost completely lost now due to IDEs. And I'm sure I could just install some plugin that would do that for me with this file, but I don't know. I kind of want to reminisce a little bit. So we have everything working there. I'm still going to do my debug step. Just because I want to show you this. I showed this once in lecture a long time ago, but it's useful enough that I want to show this again. So if I go to my command line and I do docker ps, it's going to show me all the running containers. I only have 3 containers running right now, and they're the 3 that we just spun up: my Nginx, my app, and my database. And I want to go into one of these containers, like when they're all on one line, but it's going to be too small. I want to go into one of these containers and take a look around. This is something that I found very helpful, just debugging my backup code for this. My backup configuration is entering a container. So I'm going to take my container ID for my Nginx container, and I'm going to use a specific command here, exec, which means execute a command in a specific container, -it, which I always forget what that flag means, the container ID, and then bin bash to run the bash shell. With a leading slash, we want to go from the root directory to the binary files, and then run the bash executable. If we do this, it's going to give us the command line inside the container, and we can take a look around at what's happening in this container. So we're at the root directory, and if you ever need to get to the root directory, just cd/. We'll get you there. We were already there. And I want to go to cd etc Nginx, and I can see all the Nginx files. And if I go into this conf.d, the conf daemon configuration files, I can see my default conf. And I can see that it's exactly the file that I uploaded, that I copied into this container. So it did make it into this container, into the location, the location I expect. So while debugging these things, if you have an issue with that step, go into the container and then make sure you got your configuration file where it needs to be. If you name this, for example, if you name this even 1 character off, there will be a default configuration file already preloaded from Nginx. And then you'd have 2 configuration files. That might still work. To be honest, I haven't tried that. But you would have 2 configuration files in that case. It might work. I haven't tried it, but I wouldn't try it. I mean, except by mistake. Yeah, I don't think I needed the leading // I always like to just be explicit. I think that's from JavaScript requires that I got that habit of always putting the leading // Yeah, it does help me sleep better at night too. You can use BD and it'll assume the full one. I'm not sure. Oh, the container ID. So I didn't need this whole ID, but it's, oh, I see. If I just do BD here, I'm like, what's special about BD? It's just my random ID. Okay, that's good to know. Docker system prune is a good thing. Yeah, if y'all haven't done that, let me exit out of this. Exit gets you back to your machine. And yeah, Docker system prune, if y'all haven't done this yet, I recommend it. It's going to get rid of everything that Docker set up that you're not using anymore. It'll free up usually several gigabytes of stuff after you've been using Docker all semester. Clean up all that stuff, or go to the desktop app, the Docker app, and just clean everything up. Highly recommended every once in a while. Docker can use a lot of space to have all these containers sitting on your hard drive. I just saved over a gig right there. All right, so there's one thing that I'm not going to memorize because I never memorize these, so I'm going to steal it here. Oops. Is these two things. Actually, I probably could memorize those ones, but I don't know. I just don't feel like it. But it's not too critical either. So proxy set header is going to set headers on the HTTP requests that are going to your server. And you have some variables here, like this HTTP upgrade variable. This is going to set the headers that we need for WebSocket connections, for that initial WebSocket request, upgrade, and connection. By default, these headers won't be forwarded to your app. Nginx just doesn't forward them. I don't know why. Don't ask me why. But these won't be forwarded. If you are using WebSockets in Homework 4, you need these two lines. If you're not using WebSockets in Homework 4, you don't need those two lines, and you don't have to worry about it. So since it's not required, I'll just kind of gloss over that one, though. But it's our upgrade and connection, those two headers that we need, making sure they're forward. Connection is always upgrade, but if we want to use something other than WebSockets, we want to grab the HTTP upgrade type, which will be WebSocket for our purposes, and then forward that to our container. Other things like the user's IP address too, if you want to work with IP addresses, you also have to forward those in a similar manner. Forward the IP address to the server, or else the IP address is going to be localhost, because technically the request is coming from Nginx. If you want the real IP address of the original requester, you have to forward it inside this configuration file. So just a few tips. That won't be really relevant to what we're doing. In Homework 4 would be relevant if we were using, would it be? Oh, I'd have to think about that. For WebRTC, we might need to know those IP addresses so we can uniquely identify, depending on how you're uniquely identifying clients, you might need that information. All right, so we got our setup here. We're successfully listening on port 80, and our app works, so we're happy. And this is a good place to stop for questions for a bit. Anybody have questions at this point? Yes.
So you said that you had the upgrade HTTP upgrade you put in there.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens then if you're not using WebSockets? Is that kind of great?
Then no, those headers just don't exist.
They just don't do anything.
Yeah, or yeah, they don't do anything. I mean, these headers only matter if you're reading them, and you wouldn't read them on non-WebSocket requests. Yes.
So in your Nginx Docker container, there was an nginx.conf file. What was in that?
An nginx.conf file. Let me check.
It was an XC and Nginx. It wasn't in conf.
I don't think I mess with these too much. I think it's more low-level configuration. To be honest, I've never messed with that file, but it looks like we got some more configuration that we can mess with. Oh, here's an important line though. So this will include every .conf file in that directory. So that answers that question. If you have two configuration files, as long as they don't conflict with each other, which you might conflict with the default one, it will import all of them, so that's good to know. And if you want to change that, I suppose, for our homework, you wouldn't want to, but if you want to change which ones are included. Good stuff to know. All right, no questions on Nginx setup. That's how to set up Nginx. The rest of what we need to do is get some encryption on this thing. Can you use environment variables inside the default conf file? To be honest, I don't know. inside the default conf. I don't know. I don't want to say one way or the other. I'd just be guessing. It's not something I've done before, so I don't want to try to guess an answer. All right, let's get some. Let's get some encryption on this bad boy. So I'm going to go to my slides because there's zero chance I'm memorizing this whole thing. I'm going to grab this, copy, terminal, close the container, paste. I'm watching what directory I'm in. I'm in my Nginx directory. That's where I want my certificate and key. So I'm going to run this command in there. If not, you can always move files. It's not that big of a deal. This doesn't have to be automated. So however you can get them there. And we come to our most important question, country code, the 2-digit country code. If you don't put a country code, now most of these options are, all the questions that are being asked, a lot of them are optional. If you just hit enter, it'll be left blank as it says. But the country code needs to be there. If you don't enter a country code, for some reason everything breaks. Actually, let me try that. I forget exactly how it breaks because I haven't done it in a while. But then it'll ask you state, locality name, organization name, organizational unit name, common name, email address, problems making certificate requests. So it just completely breaks right away. Nothing happened, and you wonder what happened because you cut and pasted the command exactly from the slides. I'm going to enter my 2-digit country code. Did it create them? Oh, maybe it did that first time. Just to make sure these have my country code, I'm deleting them and starting over. So I don't want to get to the end of this and have it. So it doesn't give me the error when I enter that country code, but it looks like it did create my cert and key without the country code. So then things would still break later. So you'd be like, well, it said error, but it has my files. No, they're not going to work. So now that I have my files, my certificate, which, yeah, that looks right. I have no idea. But it's all in this X509 format, which the browser is going to be able to read, and my private key. So if you want to steal this private key and then break encryption on my local host for my test environment, there it is. So we have those two files, and we want to install the cert into our Nginx configuration. So I'm going to go to my Docker file. Now these files don't need to be in a specific location, but they need to be in your container, and you need to be consistent. Wherever I put them here, I need to set that in my configuration file. So I'm going to pick a location where I know where to find them, and I'm just going to pick the Nginx directory. I'm just going to throw them in that Nginx directory. So default conf. Grab my cert, etc Nginx cert.pem, copy, private, etc Nginx private.key. So I'm going to copy those files into my Nginx container and then set up my configuration to use that cert and private key. So I'm going to add another listen here. I want to also listen on 443. And I want this communication to be encrypted. We're going to use the old naming. Nginx hasn't said, I'm not changing my naming to TLS. We're going to still use SSL. So we're going to use SSL to say encrypt the traffic on this using TLS, which I don't know why they changed the name. It just makes everything confusing. You say SSL to say use TLS. It's just how it is when they change names like that. And then we need to install the cert into this configuration. This one, I don't know if I remember. SSL. something like keychain. I have to cheat on this one. SSL certificate key. Certificate, SSL, certificate key. And then I'm going to use the same locations that we used elsewhere. So this is going to be no dot, just a slash because I used absolute paths. I don't care what directory I'm in. I'm going to say it is in this directory. Nginx / certificate was cert.pem. So it says, look here for my certificate, look here for my key. Nginx private.key. So when it sees this SSL, it's going to say, okay, that means you want to use this cert and this key. Then I'm going to use the same configuration, still using HTTP. So whether the traffic to the outside world was encrypted or not, when I talk to my internal app, to my app's container, that will not be encrypted because our app doesn't speak encryption. But going from Nginx to our app, the internet's not involved. Eavesdroppers are not involved. They can't be there. And if they are, we're screwed on so many other levels. We don't bother encrypting this traffic. And if we run this and hold our breaths, hopefully everything works. Your conf file has an icon on it. Is that a problem? I don't know. Is that in PyCharm? I don't think that would be a problem. These icons are showing the file type. Mine are just text files. So I don't know. You might have a plugin that's recognizes that as a different file type. Okay, we go over here. We make sure this still works, which sometimes it doesn't. And I can never, this one drives me nuts. In my testing, I had the same exact configuration twice. One of them worked and one of them didn't. I don't know if it's a white space issue or not. Or a semicolon. Thank God it was something obvious. I hope I don't run into that issue. I hope none of you run into that issue, I should say. Because my answer will be type it all again and see if it works right. I wonder if I missed a semicolon when I was testing too. It's possible. I feel like I looked for that, but oh, please work. Hey, so we get our site. That was already working. That's port 80. The problem is we don't get any error messages. I think we would if we go into the container and look at the logs and set up logging. But you just don't get a message. And then the big test, we're going to use https://localhost. We're going to see if we get encrypted traffic. And we're going to get this warning. Connection is not private because this is a self-signed cert. And we're going to get this whole thing that says, this is a self-signed cert. What are you doing here? And if we look at the certificate, it's there. It exists, but it says self-signed root certificate, which we can zoom. Self-signed root certificate, so there's no confidence. It has all our information, but it's self-signed, not verified. And these days, Chromium-based browsers don't let you go to the site. There used to be I understand the risks, let me do this anyway, because I know what I'm doing. I'm just testing on localhost. Why it doesn't let you go to localhost on a self-signed cert, I don't know. It's frustrating as all hell. So there are a few solutions to this. One, go to Firefox, which still lets you accept the risk and continue. Oops. Or this magical thing. I'm so happy that this exists. You go to the window, anywhere on the window, and you type the magical words, "This is unsafe." This is unsafe, all lowercase letters, and it will load your page. If you type that, it's like, all right, you know what you're doing. It's like the manual override. This works in all, I say all, but it works in Chromium browsers. I tested it in Chrome and Opera. So you can actually see your site. It's still encrypted. If we look at the source, it's still encrypted, but it's actually letting us encrypt with the self-signed cert if we type in that magical word. So we're connecting to HTTPS localhost. This is an encrypted connection over port 443. Nginx is using that cert, that private key. We have encrypted traffic. It's being decrypted and then forwarded to our app, which doesn't speak any TLS. And then the response is being sent back to Nginx. Nginx encrypts and then sends back to the browser. And nothing broke. I missed a few semicolons. That's it. I'll take that as a win. So to recap, we created a Docker file which is going to generate our Nginx container. We're copying any files that we need for the configuration. Our purposes: a configuration file, our private key, and our certificate, our self-signed cert. We have our configuration for Nginx, which is going to listen on both ports 80 unencrypted and 443 encrypted. Specify our certificate and private key. Make sure we have our server name as localhost. And then forward all traffic to our app, which has to match what we call our app in Docker Compose and whatever port you're using internal to that app. HTTP version 1.1. And then if you're using WebSockets, you need to forward these two WebSocket headers to make sure that we get that information. Like, why it skips those two headers but not the key for the WebSocket handshake? I don't know why it picks and chooses which headers to forward or not. And then in our Docker Compose, we need to add our Nginx and map local ports 80 and 443 to the ports 80 and 443 internal to the Nginx container. So whenever we get a request on localhost 80, localhost 443, it goes to Nginx. Nginx is going to forward it to our app on port 8000 in this case, and then our app happens to use Mongo as well, so we have three containers all communicating with each other to build one app, to build one experience. Yeah, at least in Java, if you're using an IDE, it'll let you know you missed a semicolon. The worst is, as an instructor in office hours, somebody's like, my code doesn't work, and the error message literally says, missing semicolon on line 15. And they're like, why doesn't my code work? That one drives me nuts. I'm glad I don't have that issue with Scala. It's hard to actually show it, unfortunately. You literally anywhere on the page, as long as this page is in focus, you type this is oops, I typed it wrong. This is unsafe. And then it just lets you do unsafe things. I guess it's like a hidden cheat code or something in the browser. I'm so glad that's a thing for so many reasons. Just so fun that that's the way it is. It's literally a cheat code. I have a PXP extension on, and is that the reason? Very possibly why it's showing your file with a different icon. That shouldn't affect anything anyway. We're not running any of these files using the IDE. I went to the command line. There's just the terminal. The IDE is linking my native terminal to the IDE. I don't think it'll matter. And we have memes. Any other questions on this? We got through that and everything ended up working. So I'm happy. Oh, goodness. I'm going to get arrested. Those grades were outdated, just for the record. That student does not have those grades right now. Just so I technically didn't leak any student records. I leaked something that's not their student record. Anything else? Anything? So this is So, and just to make sure we're clear, this is objective 5. Like, just go through this as like a guided tutorial. It's unlike the other objectives in the class where I show you kind of how to do it, and then you have to go out on your own and figure out how to do it. Objective 5 really is given to you. So don't overthink it. Follow this as a tutorial, as a guide, as like a YouTube video that you're just going through and following along. That's what Objective 5 has become. I didn't mention Apache at all, but I don't want to make it sound like Nginx is the only app, so I added Apache on there. I just chose Nginx for a tutorial because, I don't know, I like Nginx. But Nginx and Apache are the leading two servers out there, then Windows Server in a distant third. But there are other options other than Nginx, for what it's worth. Depending on what parties you go to. I almost added some more text to that. I'm like, it kind of ruins the joke if I have to explain the whole thing. Not excluding computer science parties. If the majority of the attendees are computer science majors, we'll exclude those parties. And have a great day. I'll see you Friday.